concerns with respect to GMO, for instance, that it affect negatively important farm systems in South Africa, will it then lead to a retraction of that GMO or not? Because that could be the consequence or not. Is that in the framework?
You understand clearly that this is our own interpretation. There clearly it says if it's non-acceptable impact, you go to the conclusion of the report. So it means it's not acceptable. So that's what the report says. And not acceptable in my mind means that would be a no-go for the assessment.
But sometimes, you know, some of the socio-economic impacts will be clear only after a new introduction, and then perhaps is it then still possible that the government says, well, we retract this GMO from growing in South Africa?
Interpreting our legislation in the first place, I've already said we have examples of where socio-economic part, but the economic has stopped the commercialization of products, several of them already. And then also we have a permit system with conditions. So there's definitely the gap for
after some years there's no permit.
It's not a deregulation system like it is.
Maybe just to add to that, the South African government has a new information requirement. So if during the release of a commercial product, new information becomes available that there was a new impact that hadn't been determined, then the Executive Council can retract the permit.
Thank you.
Anybody wants to get some clarity on this social-economic matter?
I just quickly want to add to what you say as well. I mean, I just said, there's a clear non-acceptable and there's a no-go point, but I don't think in terms of the social aspects, maybe there will still be evaluation by the regulators in the end of the day, because I think some of those things might not be clear cut. So all I illustrate here is the principle of something that's clearly not acceptable. But you will have to go back to what your thresholds are, the balance of risk and benefit, all those things will obviously not, it will not be as simple as I said.
Yeah, I think maybe this might be out of context, but what I want to ask is, could a condition to do a socio-economic analysis be part of the permit conditions in view of limited information available? So could the South African government pass a permit with the condition that as the release takes place, that socio-economic data be collected and analyzed, for example?
Yes, I think theoretically it's completely possible because we have this permit system and information. Yeah, and that's actually a nice idea because that, in the socio-economic area, it aligns perfectly with something like do risk, insect resistance management monitoring.
I have one small one. You kept saying the law is vague. What exactly were you trying to share with us by this vagueness? A whole law being vague?
No, it's, for example, so if you have a particular GM product and you're saying, if you just look at those examples, the continued existence and range of diversity of the biological resources in the areas inhabited and used by indigenous and local communities. What exactly does that mean? What exactly are you looking at? Because often we find ourselves, myself and my colleague, so if you have this product and you want it to this is the context in which you're working, and you need to consider that, it's like the factors. So within that you have certain criteria that you need to fulfill. So you have factors within the biodiversity. What exactly is that? It's not clear. Anybody?
Let me quickly add just to that first one that Joel said. In my mind, biological diversity in the first place, what kind of biological diversity? Inhabited by indigenous and local communities. what's the difference between indigenous and local? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about indigenous. Where do you draw the line, for example, when are you indigenous? After 200 years, 500 years, or 1,000 years? Those kind of arguments are going on. And then also, what biological diversity? If some insect disappears, that doesn't have an impact on the community, so what? But it might be important for the environmental piece. So they're just those kind of detailed things.
Maybe just to add to that, I don't think the law aims to be vague. I think the law aims to be broad.
Yes.
And so that the law covers everything. And in the regulations, the clarity will come as to the specifics. And that's just general lawmaking. To make your law broad, and then to deregulate or tightly regulate in the regulations.
Yeah, the problem is these are the regulations. It's not. So the clarity should have been. But I mean, we've got a huge history in GM regulations that are made. And the last labeling legislation, regulations is a good example.
The issue you mentioned now, you know, a difference between the law and between the regulation also implies that developing regulation is a political process, because some issues, some questions are left by the law and have to be solved by the regulation itself. So you should really imagine that in such a case, regulation is not a neutral thing, you know, because there are some decisions, some political choices are sometimes made.
Yeah, again, I think wording like indigenous populations is exactly, in my mind, indigenous populations at the kind of political level as well. This drives a lot of the discussion, and I think one of the perceptions that are in people's minds is that this external technology coming in from the northern Americas and coming into and impacting livelihoods here. So it is definitely not neutral. Okay, I must just quickly continue to the last part of the risk analysis, the risk communication. I already said yesterday or the day before that I think risk communication, I like the framework, but risk communication, we should be careful, I don't think to include general communication issues in there. Risk communication is a very specific thing between the stakeholders and things, but this does not take away from the importance of those general communication things and the debate, which I will end off with here, trying to make a few points that we can discuss again, I'm sure. So, risk communication is between the decision makers and the stakeholders. So, again, it's broad, it's more or less everybody, but it's about transparency, obviously, and that people know. And I must say, from my personal perspective, this is one of my criticisms of the South African system, is that we are definitely not as transparent as we should be. So yesterday somebody brought up the old, I think it was 2005 court case between BioWatch and the registrar, which the BioWatch won. There was lots of appeals later on, but the appeals were about costs that were awarded and not about the principle. The principle was that this information, people have the constitutional right to know of this information. Of course, the big bone of contention is what is confidential business information and what is not. And there's obviously room there for disagreement and for, what's the word of people not playing exactly by the rules. So those things should be clear. But I think in principle we would all agree that decision making should be transparent. And this is what I like, for example, of the Australian system, where they do the internal risk assessment and they publish that. So they say on what grounds did they make the particular decision. And in the South African system, we only get, the decision was made in the agenda of the document. And I've had long discussions with lots of different people in the EC, and they're not likely to change quickly. So. Then it's important that risk analysis, reasoning imposed on risk assessment, it's just about communicating exactly what I said now, so I'm not going to repeat it. And then more general communication is the last part. I mean, we all know the story. This is an old set of data from 2006, but the point is we've touched on these things often during this workshop as well, because these are the things that people talk about. But we must be clear that GM food, this pink, you will see that it's people opposed to different technologies. So pharmacogenetics, even things like gene therapy that you would think are very sensitive to people. Food GM food stands out as being controversial.
Europe.
In Europe, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's all over, probably. I think, yeah, we can discuss about the quantity at some stage, but obviously what people feel is, and this is the thing that sometimes worries me if we talk about people that really understand. I mean, if you understand the issues, being exposed to all of these things is not an issue, but what you are exposed to and you don't understand is, I think that's where the problem lies. So, in any case, these are my own conclusions, is that people's beliefs, the risk are shaped by their core values. So just education, you know, there's a place for education, obviously. But you're not going to change people's mind just by education. And the argument, especially that Shark had the other day here about the value of food in a particular environment, for example, is a good example of that, I think. And then the credibility of the source of information is important. And this is our discussion about neutrality and balance and all those kind of things yesterday that we started off with. But it means that even if you think you balance, you want to give a certain perspective. People, remember your neutrality or wherever you are positioned is not judged by you, it's judged from other people's positions. So they will very easily put you to the left or the right, depending on their own position. And then this is, in my mind, the crux in the end of the day. Some of this will definitely disappear in the food. Remember, we're talking only about food safety. I gave you the examples of recombinant DNA-based medicines, and there's never a word written about that almost. But I think the crux, the underlying thing there is the risk-benefit perception of people. Yeah, the point is a perception is real to the individual that has it. And then I think the sustainability is obviously the key to this. We need credible biosafety information to support our arguments of sustainability. And then the last point, and this is a very vague one, everybody asked yesterday, the countries that were represented, that their legislation include ethical consideration. Exactly what does it mean? How many churches was the question? Which churches will be included? All those kind of things. But the point is, I think ethics is something we share. So people should not also only look at when they're in that position to say, I should do this because it's what the law asks of me. You must do it within that bigger kind of concept of ethics and humanity. So then the point I want to make here about communication is, for regulators often, it's difficult to assess these things because what you're exposed to is somehow radically different to the data that you then are presented. And I just use this as one of the examples. It's not as well known as the Seralini and the Pushta and all those type of things. But this just, I saw this evolve in front of my eyes, and this is what I can say. There was a research paper, and I think, yeah, it's in Canada, that says, you know, the fetuses are exposed to the pesticide. So obviously it's about the pesticide itself, it's not about the BT or the herbicide tolerance gene itself. And then obviously something like fetuses and pregnant women are very sensitive issues in most people's minds. So what they've done, that is the paper that was published. The very next thing that you'll read on the internet is GM toxic chemicals found in pregnant women's feces. So you see, just the way it says more or less the same thing, but the way that it's packaged is to, you know, to transfer a message. And then the next thing, you have all these links, you know, it's like a network. So fact is translated into absolute nonsense very quickly. And this is what sticks in people's mind. So they make this mental connection very easily. But if you really then go and look at the data, I just put the boring data there for you, but the principle is, it was very low conditions. And even in the paper itself, it said the levels of exposure. Remember we spoke about exposure in our environmental risk assessment. Of course, when we use chemicals, every chemical that we use, the shampoo and the lotions that you used this morning, is part of our life. What regulators do in terms of herbicides, for example, they must make sure that those levels are safe, or the chemicals have safe levels in the environment for us. So the point is, what they measure was, or the reference they made in here was to another paper that said at this level, the chemicals starting to have an impact. But what they measured in the end of the day was 186 times lower than that. So you see, if you really look at the data, it shows that the regulatory systems are actually working because it keeps these chemicals at the levels that are safe to humans. But you can, tell the story in a completely different way to people that don't know. So then this is the part that I said I will quickly to get some discussion going. So my issue with the debate, we touched on some of these things, but this is not really communication. It's just a level of, people writing WhatsApps and messages on the internet and blogs. That's a little bit frustrating to me at sometimes, and disheartening. It makes you lose faith in that we're actually getting somewhere. So my point is, most of these things, it doesn't matter which article you read. If you look at the comments below them on the internet, it's more or less always the same thing. And those things are driven by worldviews or dogma. So, and then it's the issue about science-based and ideology-based things. And then one other thing that you often hear is, that one side is there only to make money and, whatever they want to do. But the point is, everybody in the discussion has vested interest in some way or another. So we can't distinguish in terms of how important this debate is for one or the other. It's equally important to both sides of the debate. This is my, I use neutral again, so we can talk about that again. But there is actually no such thing because, as I said earlier, your neutrality or unbiased is judged by somebody else. So if he's on the right of you, he would think you're left. If he's on the left of you, he would think you're right. So, and then my big frustration is that this debate does not evolve. I remember when I started doing this type of work in the 1990s, and many of the discussions are exactly the same things. So, I would say, in principle, a strategic communication plan to talk to these things should at least, should increase awareness. So you said this is the education part, not that I think it's the most important thing of all, and engage with stakeholders. So I think it's more about building that trust. And then relationships, it comes in the second one, especially with regulators. You can also see this from the perspective of a developer. You must convince the regulator, that you have the best intentions, obviously. You want to make sure that your product is sustainable, otherwise you are the idiot if you don't have a sustainable product. You want to solicit support and build confidence. I already said it, I think that's very important. Preempt issues. I already referred earlier to things like people now wanting to do GM trees, for example. Preempt all the issues that's coming. I think this was one of the biggest things when there was still some idea of doing GM grapevine in South Africa, is when they applied for the field trial. What the anti-GMO lobby did is they phoned individual winemakers. I mean, it's people that's far removed from the research. They said, did you know about this? Did you know you know how it's going to impact the market? So it was not clearly communicated to those people that this is what we're doing, this is our intentions, and this is the only things we want to do. So immediately they jumped to real impacts, and obviously run its course. And ensure that things are fact-based. I think facts, obviously, does not necessarily always agree with your own view, but as long as it's facts, we can talk about it. And this is my personal view, where I usually say, if you come and say, my choice is not to do this, it's the end of the discussion. I'm not going to try and convince you because it's a choice. But don't come to me and say it's going to give me cancer and I'm not going to eat it, because then you touched on something which I'm convinced of is not true. And that's the end of it, so we can continue.
Can you show your last slide, please? Because I would like to give a comment on some of the statements, especially in the middle. We see a great majority of the publicly accessible debate is therefore non-fact, basic rhetoric, and it doesn't evolve. That is true, but in my view, the debate is actually often value-based. So facts are not always so important because it has to deal with values. And by saying it's rhetoric, you are pushing it away. And so you are not really neutral in this because you have your own value that you do say here. And of course it did not evolve, I agree, because it was so much based on scientific facts and not on values. So it is still there. So scientists also have a kind of responsibility that the debate did not go on because they stick to the fact-based issues and do not always recognize the values that are on stake. That's an important thing to say, and that's a fact, so to say. And sure, GM discussions are fact-based. I do not agree because there are so much values involved. So by sticking to facts, you are missing something. I think that's the point.
Yeah. Let me start off by the first thing. My fourth point is actually that I say we can't be objective in the true sense of the word, anybody. So I agree 100% with you there. And I agree actually with what you said. So the only thing what I'm going to do is I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but I'm going to say why I sometimes disagree with being that considerate. And it's got to do with this reaffirmation of context, which I pointed out earlier. Because sometimes I just get frustrated with the fact is, why is this only for GM food? Like, why values are important? I mean, that's a principal issue, I agree with that. But why are values now suddenly more important for food than it is for medicines, for example? And then also, why do then, because the argument is then not only on value, this is where I agree with you, this is what I said, if you say this is your choice, because that's your value choice. And I will never try to influence your value. But if you, this is what I said, what is then used is this confusing mess of, it's not good for the environment or its health, we go through these things, then it's socioeconomics, we're going to impact indigenous people, it's all these kind of very emotional. The last point I want to make is about the value. What did I want to say about values? Sorry, I'm not even talking about it.
Yes, I agree with both of you. But I think we have to admit that the debate has evolved on the science side. So wherever there has been misinformation and scientists and regulators have stepped in and said, this is not correct, those issues have fallen off the table. And we can list a whole lot of tryptophans and all sorts of things that have fallen off the table. And they've fallen off the table because regulators have stepped in and said, this is misinformation. Where we haven't evolved is on the value side. Much more difficult to take.
Anybody wants to step into the debate? Okay, Ivo.
I'm just thinking that maybe we should ask ourselves, why is the public remaining so skeptical about these things after so many years and after the debate has evolved for so long? Because you mentioned the issue of transparency. Of course, if a regulator is reluctant to give me the basis of his information, I'll be skeptical. So maybe there are practices and issues within the regulatory system that is fueling this skepticism. So instead of just pointing at the public, maybe we should also look at ourselves as regulators and see how we are fueling this type of negative perceptions about the technology.
Now, of course, the problem with that is it's a catch-22 situation, because I think that one of the big reasons why regulators become a little bit reluctant to share is because it's controversial. So everything they use are taken into this
Yeah, so
mess, and then they don't.
but it needs to be addressed somehow.
No, it does, of course. I mean, I can't say it more than 1 million times that I have already. The public is the end goal of the technology, so you can't exclude it. And I really don't do it. This distinction that Matthew referred to, I try to draw the contrast between the risk discussion and this debate thing. What really gets me down is if you go onto the internet, if somebody publishes a paper, it doesn't matter on which side, and you then look at the response from the people in general, it's always the same things, it's these completely polar things. And I agree 100% with you, the people in the know and involved in this at whatever level, regulators or developers or even people, you know, that looking after the society's goals, but are informed, that discussion is completely at a different level.
Okay, we'll take another question and then over here at the back. We are now into tea time, so
Keep it short.
keep it short so that we don't get.
I have been privileged to sit with stakeholders from all sorts of backgrounds, and I have appreciated that this debate may continue like this unless there is a strategic way of communicating to each other. We do not talk to each other. We think we are talking to each other, but we are not. Simply because some have built walls around them, and they actually are building strategies of how to convince the public to maybe be negative, let me put it like that. And we as scientists, as developers of the technology, as people who have a factual understanding of the technology, may be the ones who are placed in a position to strategize how to communicate with the various stakeholders. It's a challenge, I know, but it's something that needs to be done, otherwise the debate will continue. Unfortunately, the other group is good at tactics of involving politicians, and politicians are in charge of our policies, and the policies can stop a lot of things that perhaps could have benefited society.
I don't want to keep you from, sorry,
Yeah, there's some.
Thank you, sir. My comment is this. What is it that the conventional hybrid producers did right? Because I believe when they were coming onto the scene, into the market, they faced similar resistance. What is it that they did right, and what is it the GMO group has done wrong? If there's anything they've done wrong, what is it that needs to be done? Because the two groups should be similar. My late grandfather, struggled to accept hybrid, but over time he did. So what is it that they did right, and what is it that we're not doing? GMO regulators?
my answer, which I tried to give in one of the slides, is shortly benefits. People were only convinced after they actually saw the benefits. And this value benefit discussion that we're taking on, I also like to use, you know, other technologies. Some people criticize and say that, you know, it's not valid to compare the one thing with the other thing. But I think we can at least learn some things from those. You used, what do you call it, hybrids just now. I like to think of, coming back to the value discussion a little bit, to cell phones. I mean, cell phones have had a huge impact on our society. You see everywhere jokes and people, you know, they're just sitting there, things, and teenagers are not talking to their parents and all those kind of things. It's huge value societal impact. But nobody really, except that academics, discuss this in long terms.
I come back on this issue also of the hybrid next.
Okay, great stuff. So I'm not going to elaborate too much. But you see, these are the things. It's the benefit. We don't care about those other things, but we're in the position, like GM food. There's other options at the moment. Now somebody comes with this GM thing that I've heard might give you cancer. I've heard that Monsanto's going to run my life and all of those things. And I think, no, I'd rather have one and I criticize that because there's no benefit for it in it for me. So it's only, I think, in the end of the day, we're going to change the dialogue when there's a real benefit for the end consumer. Because you can also contrast the acceptance rate between farmers of GM crops and the general public. We've had plenty of examples, Argentina, Burkina Faso, where it's the farmers, it's the sprouts on the bottom that for all the technology they saw it.
Okay, maybe this will trigger another discussion. This is GM is technology like any other technology. You have mentioned cell phones. Nobody has forced people to use cell phones. Why are we using much time and energy to preach about GMOs? Why can't we leave it for people to see the benefit and then they'll go for it automatically?
The medicines, how do they see the benefits?
Yeah.
The gene therapy and all that.
All right, it's really getting into the
Quickly,
debate.
I just want to illustrate what we've discussed now. This is another thing that I'm busy developing the idea, and again, I try to get a framework for the things that we discuss. And what I see, we within a particular context. I mean, when Ida talk about things, we within this first context, we talk about risk management, all the things that I talked about. We understand each other. There's no if we don't agree on something, we will sit around tea and quickly we will come to at least, some kind of a conclusion. The problem is the people that don't understand and are not part of this, that we always say we should educate them, which I don't really like the idea, but they are on a completely different thing. They have a risk perception, and obviously they do a lot of very effective communication, and we can also say those two different contexts in which we are is obviously two different frames. And one of the big problems to us is this completely different frame has a huge impact on us, and this is one of the reasons why we keep on talking about these things, because we want to change this influence on our environment, because we want the technologies to be accepted, and we want not to have this huge regulatory burden and all those kind of things. So we have to communicate, and this is the type of communication that I think. The other communication here within our context is not important. Obviously it's important, we already said that, but it's not the problem. This is the thing that we should consider. Thanks.
All right, I mean, it's a long debate, it's a long story. I also have my input into this. And he is a member of the Netherlands Commission on Genetic Modification, subcommittee on ethical and societal aspects. So he is really going to share with us a lot of the things that are always happening around.
A lot of topics that were discussed the last 2 days, and this morning I will go into it. What I will do, I will discuss more on what do we mean by science, what do we mean by technology, and how is that related to society. Yesterday it was Doreen who said